Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Zoom window of the Center for Armenian Studies at the University of Michigan. My name is Gottfried Hagen. I am a professor of Turkish Studies here, and I have the honor to serve as the director of the Center for Armenian Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, 1 year ago, almost to the day, Azerbaijani military forces occupied the former province of Nagorno-Karabakh, leading to the dissolution of the Republic of Artsakh and the flight of almost the entire Armenian population to the territory of Armenia. So this was the dramatic end to a years-long pressure campaign, most drastically evident in the month-long blockade of the only road from Armenia into Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan. Was the end of a dream of national self-determination. It's triggered a humanitarian crisis, a fiasco for Armenia at the international and national level, a triumph for the dictatorship of Azerbaijan. So there's many ways of describing this, and hardly any of them positive. Critically, we have seen the collapse of an national aspiration and an Armenian self-narrative in the face of military force. And so today, we've convened this event to ask what has happened since then. How have narratives in Armenia and in Azerbaijan also changed? How is this event viewed? Is there a way forward? What can be done? I want to say at this point that originally this event was designed as a panel discussion with several participants. However, to our dismay, one of the participants has been, about 2 weeks ago, has been detained in Azerbaijan. And has been and seems to be still in detention since then. And another panelist subsequently withdrew her participation because she did not feel safe. So we have converted this in a more of a two-way conversation. However, to shed light on this whole chapter and to talk about the next chapter in the conflict, we have invited into our Zoom window Professor Philip Gamaghelyan, who's an associate professor at the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego, where he teaches courses in conflict analysis and resolution, mediation, media, nationalism and conflict, and more. Professor Gamaghelyan is a conflict resolution scholar practitioner, and that is a perspective we thought would be particularly valuable at this point here. He has, in fact, also written a book about this, Conflict Resolution Beyond an International Relations Paradigm, Evolving Designs as a Transformative Practice in Nagorno-Karabakh and in Syria. He's the founder and board member of the Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation and an editor at Caucasus Edition, a journal of conflict transformation that you can find online at caucasusedition.net. He has worked in the post-Soviet states, as well as in Turkey and Syria and other conflict regions, engaging policymakers, journalists, educators, social scientists, and other discourse-creating professionals. And we're very pleased. Thank you, Phil, for joining us here. We'll have a quick a conversation over probably the next 20 minutes to half hour, depending on how this unfolds. I have a series of questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience as well. So as we go along, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to write us your question, and we will address them one by one in due course. So again, welcome, Phil, and thank you. And maybe we can start by just looking at the different perspectives that have been brought to bear in this context, the divergence of the national narratives here between Azerbaijan on one side and Armenia on the other, and how they have told themselves this history basically since 1994, since the first war over the region. Can you tell us a little bit of how these have been presented to national and international audiences? Are there, and I'd be curious what kind of sort of tropes, arguments, narrative patterns we would encounter here.
So first of all, thank you, Professor Hogan, for the invitation. And yeah, I want to also express solidarity with our colleague from Baku who has been detained, and I believe he's now charged with treason, exactly for collaboration with Armenian scholars, which is a very, very unfortunate development. So yeah, happened to be now the only panelist. But once again, thanks for persevering and moving forward with the event. So the question, yeah, you asked was is about the narratives starting from 1994, both domestic and international. I'll start from domestic. And we probably should go back to past prior to 1990s, of course, because they didn't come out of nowhere, of course. But I'll start from 1990s for the sake of time. And domestically, the narratives in Armenia and Azerbaijan in regard to this conflict very much mirrored each other. And they were very similar to somewhat what you would expect, especially in 1990s period of nationalist movements in Eastern Europe. But overall, all over the world, there's quite a clear pattern of building domestic narratives of national mobilization. So these two narratives very much followed somewhat, I would say, established patterns, where each side very systematically presents itself as simultaneously the victim and the hero of the narrative, and the other a very kind of clear-cut villain in the story. Right. So if again I'm answering the question of how to think of this as a narrative, the details, of course, differed. Each side likes to accuse the other one of telling untruths, but that's not necessarily the case. Having studied these narratives, instead of relying on some kind of lies, which somehow each side likes to think what the other side does, there is a very small element of straight up untruths. The narratives are mostly extremely selective. So each side picked from history, from the events that happened, the ones, or rather a pattern that better fits their storyline. And the audience being in Armenian Studies space probably knows well the Armenian narrative, but I'll briefly restate and then maybe turn to the Azerbaijani one briefly as well. So the Armenian one was that, this is indigenous to the, of course, Aryan nation, right, that has been around for a long time. As a small Christian nation, has been surrounded by potentially Muslim invaders throughout the centuries, continually has been persecuted. Yeah, so there's the victim part. It has been subjected to genocides, ethnic cleansings, all kinds of discriminations. And then there's the hero part of the story, which is somehow persevered and survived, right? So despite overwhelming force on the other side, despite being much smaller, continually persevered. And as Nagorno-Karabakh independence movement developed, I wouldn't say that Nagorno-Karabakh had much of a place in Armenian narrative prior to 1990s, in a general meta-narrative, but it became very central in late 1980s and 1990s. And somehow that became almost this cornerstone that really survived more almost than other parts, right? It became very central since 1990s for the Armenian narrative. And then this is the Armenian side, right? And again, continually subjected to genocides and everything, including the discrimination of Karabakh Armenians throughout Soviet time potentially, and potential for some kind of a mass violence against Karabakh Armenians was all put into this meta-narrative of past and potentially future genocides that we need to survive, right? And then the other side, in this case, Azerbaijanis, were then seen as part of some kind of a broader, bigger, kind of scary enemy, which used to be maybe Mongols, and then Persians, and then Ottoman Turks, and then Turkish Turks, and then Azerbaijanis who have some Turkish affiliation. But somehow, if you read this narrative throughout centuries, in a way, the presentation is there's some kind of a scary other, and the other tends to be Muslim, right? And then this newest iteration of that scary Muslim is actually the Azerbaijani. Why it's important, because you don't only ascribe then to Azerbaijanis anything recent that happened, but in some form within the narrative structure, you think of it as connected to all the past injustices towards Armenians. And then you look also into demographic data, which is quite selectively chosen. For example, the common part of narrative was that Nakhchivan was populated by 50% Armenians in the beginning of 20th century, and then as passed under Azerbaijan, the number now is 0, right? So you have kind of some soft version of ethnic cleansing. Then the look is into Karabakh population, which was 99% Armenian, and then 75% Armenian. But interestingly, you pick a very particular date for the beginning of your story, right? So the 99% date is quite a specific date, so it wasn't necessarily the case throughout history. It's exactly the beginning of the Soviet Union, when the Nagorno-Karabakh autonomy was formed in a particular border. Azerbaijan has, now that's Armenia, that we know well, probably in this, in the people you have invited here, right? Azerbaijan narrative is, again, in terms of story, very similar. So they are by and large seeing themselves as some form of indigenous group that's been there, right? So Caucasian Albanians or somebody else that with time also incorporated Turkish and Shia Muslim Persian essential influence. Armenians, yes, existed, but they were mostly somewhere further, as in what we call now Anatolia, right? In present-day Turkish territory or Persian territory, Iranian territory. And with the Russian conquest of the Caucasus in essentially 18th century, only their numbers grew. There was a population exchange between Russian Empire and the Persian Empire, where Muslims were deported into Iran, and Christians, namely Armenians, were actually deported from Persia into Russian Empire, and the number of Armenians suddenly in this territory grew, and that created essentially more demands from Armenians for political rights that culminated eventually for the Karabakh movement, right? So, and then they have their stories of massacres perpetrated by, well, Armenians, as in others, could be Russians, but specifically the focus is on any kind of participation of Armenians, namely in 1918. There was a massacre in Baku, and then also later, already in 1990s, during the Second Karabakh War. So again, this mirror narrative are now they are the indigenous, and the Armenians are newcomers, supported by now Christian, bigger other, who is the Russian Empire, right, that actually imports Armenians and creates essentially a persecution of Muslims and massacres of Muslims. And they are the ones who are surviving now this kind of onslaught from now Christian others. So again, very mirroring narratives. The dates are chosen very, again, selectively. So in that case, they look into very different demographics, right? They look into demographics prior to Russian takeover of the Caucasus, where the number of Muslim inhabitants is larger, especially in territory of Azerbaijan and Karabakh. And then after the population exchange, the numbers of Christians grow, kind of creating this balance. Then you have waves of deportations of Muslims, specifically Azerbaijanis, during the Soviet period and so on. So the numbers continually, in their view, shift in favor of Christians. So you see these very mirroring narratives where you absolutely don't notice, don't realize, don't see, don't want to see the other story. And from your story and from very selective demographics and dates and facts, it looks pretty clean cut that, yes, you are a majority and you've been systematically discriminated by some kind of global other on the ground, effectively supported by the local other, yeah, so either Armenians or Azerbaijanis. So this is the background story that really continues to mobilize both societies against each other. Both see the other respectively as the local existential threat that supports some kind of a bigger existential threat coming from either Christian other or from the Muslim other. And that played really strongly towards mobilization and towards people's willingness to participate in the war effort. So this is the domestic story, which still plays out. Now the international story is quite different, and then at some point they interlink. The international story, the was in 1990s, of course, where Soviet Union collapsed and there was this latest wave of decolonization and also the end of history, meaning that at that point it looked like the liberal democracies won the day and, well, at the time looked won perpetually. And we will be living in some kind of a liberal democratic world of international norms. And both sides internationally adopted international law-based narratives. Armenian side, that of self-determination of Karabakh Armenian population, and the Azerbaijani side, that of territorial integrity of the Azerbaijani state. What happened? So this is essentially more internationally focused one, right? So Azerbaijan talking about in territorial integrity, Armenians for self-determination. Gradually, this narrative started merging, of course, the domestic one, international one, and specifically focusing on Azerbaijani one, I'd say in the longer term won the day for a number of reasons, but one that territorial integrity argument remained acceptable, let's say, perpetually for the wider international audience, because kind of irrespective of almost presence or absence of democracy and democratic norms, the kind of the more Westphalian principle of national boundaries is quite strong. And again, absolutely irrespective of democratic norms, right? And the Soviet Union collapse was accepted specifically in the borders of 15 constituting republics. Yeah, so essentially not to continually fracture the remnants of the Soviet Union. The international agreement is on essentially this 15 constituting republics, Armenia, Azerbaijan, in their Soviet borders are the ones accepted internationally, and nobody really challenged that. Yeah, so you see Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's seen as an invasion. So Crimea's self-determination is not accepted necessarily internationally as for much of a value, right? Because we accept the Soviet borders. So in that sense, Karabakh continually has been seen as part of Azerbaijan internationally, and nobody, including Armenia, ever recognized for whatever reasons. So that narrative persevered, internationally. And the Armenian narrative of self-determination, I think, shot itself in the foot when the Armenian side, with a military effort, expanded outside of Nagorno-Karabakh autonomy. So what happened in 1990s when the first war was won by the Armenian side, it not only took control of the disputed territory of former autonomy of Nagorno-Karabakh, but also expanded way further outside of it to much bigger Azerbaijani, essentially uncontested initially territory. And as a result of ethnic cleansing, hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis were deported from territories that were, again, uncontested part of Azerbaijan. And the Armenian side then started incorporating these territories way outside of Nagorno-Karabakh itself into what became known on Armenian side as the Republic of Artsakh. So that really shot that, in my view, the idea of self-determination in the foot, because if we're talking about the rights of 100,000 Armenians in some kind of a determined territory, autonomy, that's voted for independence, suddenly you are making a claim to much bigger, 2, 3, 4 times bigger territory that has been almost exclusively inhabited by Azerbaijanis and had any kind of legal basis for even a claim for independence or incorporation into Armenia or independence. So that's completely, I think, weakened the narrative internationally. And yet it contradicted Armenian internal narrative, which was that we are liberating all these territories because they are ancestral homelands. So I think that was this very big, I say tactical mistake, but also narrative mistake in Armenian side, that laying claim for much bigger territory that they had any kind of view on in anybody's really eyes in legitimate sense. So I think that has been a very big problem, why things developed the way they developed.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I think it's very important to understand so the not only so the demographic, but also so this status in terms of national and international law. So the questions of the recognition of borders and so on. So thank you for pointing that out. I wanted to ask you briefly, because this is more by way of background than as sort of the central question for our conversation here. But whether you could sort of just outline how this has played out in international relations, because it's such a complicated network of connections. There is great powers, Russia sort of close by, expectations from the US, the EU on the other side. There have been regional players like Turkey, Iran, and to some degree Israel involved in this. Can you just quickly give us a sense of whether sort of in which directions these powers pull or push when it comes to this to Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Of course. So again, we need to differentiate the 90s from 2000s from what's happening now, right? In 90s and 2000s, by and large, these two countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, had quite a lot of agency in perpetuating the conflict, the way they prosecuted it and its aftermath, and in their negotiations. Yes, of course, there were smaller states, and yes, of course, Russia and international actors had quite a important role. But by and large, if you see this role was, including from Russia, was quite ambiguous. So especially in the 90s, you've seen certain Russian support for Armenian war effort and certain Russian support for Azerbaijani war effort. Russia also mediated the ceasefire. And by and large, you see throughout 1990s and 2000s, the actually very concerted effort by the international community, well, or international actors, let's say US, Russia, and France initially itself, and later representing to the European Union, actually jointly acting as mediators, and maybe not always, but in many cases in good faith, but specifically as mediators, not as imposers of peace, not as imposers of some kind of own agendas necessarily, but as mediators. And that's been rare. Almost as the Russia and West relations deteriorated, they continued in this particular case to collaborate. I think it was a pretty important mistake for Armenia and Azerbaijan not to take that, which was a rare situation when global powers were essentially aligned in trying to advance a peace agenda here, not to take advantage of that opportunity. Specifically, we can look the latest period when that was possible, I'd say, is Dmitry Medvedev presidency in Russia between 2008 2011, simultaneously with Obama in the US, when they tried to reset the relations between Russia and US, and Karabakh specifically was taken as a case on which they wanted to collaborate. And Medvedev essentially was supported by Obama and Europe in advancing negotiations towards solution. He held like 9 meetings back to back almost within 2-3 years. And effectively the sides refused to step back from their quite maximalist positions. So again, this is a very unique period, I would say, when you have good 20 years when you were free to prosecute the conflict. And then your peace supported by international actors, which we did not take advantage of. Yes, geopolitics mattered, but they were secondary to actually the local dynamics of the conflict. It completely flipped after 2012. Actually, I remember writing an article, I think in 2011, that this is the last chance for us to solve this directly. So it's the last probably chance when we have actually agency in over our own territories and our own conflict. As Putin came back with much more assertive, let's say, to use a soft word here, agenda in 2012, that almost stopped being the case. And then Russia became increasingly an assertive actor. So, for example, if before that the negotiations were around something called Madrid Principles, which was that there is some kind of an agreement and there is an international peacekeeping force coming in, then it was very clear from that point on that if any peacekeeping, that's going to be Russian army essentially coming into the region, right? So Russia wanted to be the sole kind of deal breaker and it's a kingmaker, but also power holder following any kind of an agreement. So that was Russia's increased push. That was then countered by West's own attempt to play its own game, and increasingly it became essentially get out of the hands of necessarily the local parties, and increasingly what I'd say is a proxy conflict, not a proxy war yet, at least, but a proxy conflict in the sense of now this is seen as a region over which the West and Russia and Turkey and increasingly Iran and now India and China from the other side all fight. Again, they don't fight yet militarily. Of course, there was 2020 war, but they fight quite actively politically, economically. And now it became a region where essentially it's being pulled in very quite different directions. So that's a very, very major change. And you do see kind of continual push and pull, and some actors gaining more traction than others. Obviously, in 2020, Russia and Turkey gained an upper hand by essentially actively participating in one way or another in the war, and pushing, it looked like, the West out. But then Russian invasion of Ukraine changed this equation. Russia got weakened and got pushed out, including by Azerbaijan. And then the West started reasserting itself, in particularly improving relations with Armenia. Right, so Iran is stronger, making claim that it wouldn't accept, any arrangements that don't take its national interest into consideration. Again, India suddenly supplying arms to Armenia is a much, much stronger player than you would ever see. So it's much more similar to something you would expect to see in the Middle East, let's say 20 years ago, than what we were used to seeing in Caucasus, where it was somewhat uncontested sphere of Russian influence, along with maybe some form of soft European integration policies, right? So it's now very heavily contested territory. And yeah, it's impossible now to make any analysis without thinking of it as a proxy conflict area.
Wow, this is very hard to sort of condense down to a single formula, or sort of nice the absence of sort of neat front lines, I think, are sort of one of the characteristics here. And I'm sure our audience will have questions and will ask you to elaborate on this. But I want to, for the moment, proceed and ask more about the present. So you have mentioned acts of ethnic cleansing, both the basically the ethnic cleansing of the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh itself, of all the Armenian population, basically leaving for the Republic of Armenia. You have also mentioned long prior to that, ethnic cleansings in parts of occupied Azerbaijan. And so I wanted to ask you about sort of that, so the humanitarian status there, and specifically about the Armenians who have left Nagorno-Karabakh. Are they in their majority in Armenia? What is their status? Is there a perspective for integration, or are they kind of in a holding pattern? Are there expectations of eventual return? What does this look like on the ground?
Actually, let me start from the ethnic cleansings, because they have strong implications for the possibilities of return or any kind of coexistence. So unfortunately, this conflict has been seen through these domestic narratives that we started with as such an existential and exclusive that so once the conflict actually started in the recent phase in 1990s, any of the sides taking control of anything would immediately result in full ethnic cleansing of the other. Right? So the initial waves were not in Karabakh, actually, the initial waves of effectively deportations or violence that resulted in exodus was out of still Soviet Azerbaijan, where Armenians of Baku and the time Kirovohrad, now Ganja, and Sumgait were attacked and cleansed, and in Armenia simultaneously the Azerbaijanis who were heavily populated in the south of Armenia, Zangezur or Syunik, but also other parts of Armenia were also attacked, and then essentially were all almost exclusively, maybe minus 3-4 people known actually left. So you have this initial round of ethnic cleansings in 1990s, which again, whoever controlled which territory would result in complete cleansing of the other side. Then these patterns, this is 80s still, then this pattern carries over to the war. So which side takes control of what? Essentially, the other side is attacked so badly that is either massacred or actually is forced to leave. And again, it's since the Armenian side ends up taking then control. So Baku refugees from Armenians come to Armenia, right? Azerbaijanis go to Azerbaijan from the south of Armenia. And then as Armenia takes control over not only Karabakh, but also wider territory. So all the Azerbaijanis in these territories are cleansed. What it led to is this complete perception that its coexistence is impossible. So you cannot have any form of Karabakh, right? So where you can coexist. Let's say why autonomy was so harshly negatively reacted by both sides, because autonomy would mean some form of coexistence, right? So autonomy potentially would mean, if it's autonomy in Azerbaijan, then you need to somehow coexist with Azerbaijani government, right? Or if Azerbaijan doesn't take full control of Karabakh, then it means they need to in some form coexist with Armenians. And this history of ethnic cleansing and mass violence really left almost no room for this kind of imagination. So that's also fast forward to 2020 and then 2023, as Azerbaijan takes control, it's actually then now fully ethnically cleanses Armenians. So yeah, it doesn't take control and say, okay, so it's internationally recognized Azerbaijan, great, now let's, have a minority status. It was not really ever any kind of a serious discussion, right? So it was discussed, but essentially you knew it wasn't going to happen. It's either de facto independence or it's full ethnic cleansing, which we saw happening. So this is the backstory, which is why it's extremely hard without some kind of massive, serious structural change and change in narratives to imagine anybody going back from Armenians, because for 30, 40 years, we saw this exclusively as whoever controls it. That's exclusively their land, and none of the other can safely live in your territory. Armenians did the same, and Azerbaijanis are now doing the same. Fast forwarding to the status, the question of the Karabakh Armenians. Yes, almost everybody, the majority is in Armenia, of those who were deported, ethnically cleansed, or left Karabakh last year. They are, again, there is no any kind of mass exodus out of Armenia, as far as I know, which is different from 1990s, by the way, when the Baku refugees came in, Armenians, and they couldn't really adapt to the life. They were not necessarily welcomed, and majority of them left for Russia or US or France, but they actually, Armenia didn't stay too long in Armenia. Some migrated, but majority left. This is not the case yet. You do see a majority staying so far. In terms of humanitarian situation, I'm sure it's easy to say, I'm not in that position, but as in more of an outside big picture look, it looks like that it was managed quite well. The settlement of 100,000 people, it's a very big number for Armenia, which has a population of probably under 3 million. But the migration service specifically and other services worked extremely well. And again, for the extent of accepting such a big influx of refugees, right? And at least on a daily basis, manage this process quite well, I would say. Essentially, no kind of known instances, right, of the violence or deaths, or a lot of people were settled. Of course, it cannot go too easy. It's very unequal. Some people, have their funds and money and able to, move to places they want. Others are lost everything, right? So it's not a good situation. But for the size of the problem, let's say, I believe it was managed as well as it could be managed. So this is the humanitarian part. It's problems, but they are being quite well managed, I would say, from the extent Armenian state is capable. The legal status is trickier. Actually, they are by and large not Armenian citizens. They, for some are, but a lot of them, for different reasons, did not at the time accept Armenian citizenship. They had Armenian travel passports, but they effectively are now invalid. And effectively, a lot of people have no necessarily status. They are welcome to, as far as I know, by Armenian legislation to apply and become Armenian citizens, because similar to a lot of European states, there is a legislation about any Armenian background person can apply. So you can be American Armenian as well and get citizenship in expedited way. So in principle, this road is open, and increasing number are taking opportunity. But I don't believe there is any kind of mass movement towards accepting the Armenian citizenship either. So a lot of people are still in limbo. A lot of people are dealing with trauma. A lot of people are dealing with daily, trying to find a place to live and settle, and for different reasons not going that route yet. Perhaps a lot of them holding the hope of return and thinking that taking Armenian citizenship gonna jeopardize the chance to return. But from what I know, again, I don't know too much about this, but some majority of them are still not citizens effectively of any country. Yeah, there is a question you asked, I believe, or no?
I think you have covered all of that. Thank you. So let us then talk about what a way forward would look like. What do the parties actually want to accomplish? What is Armenia's idea of dealing with this? And I'm specifically sort of picking an open-ended formulation rather than saying resolving it, right? Because a resolution might be sort of generations off, but where does Armenia want this to go? How are the actual refugees thinking about this? What is Azerbaijan's ambitions beyond this? And of course, that all will raise ultimately the question of how will the big international players in international relations, as well as the term you skipped over previously, the international community, right, as organizations like the UN or so, look at this. So of course, this is the big question. So let me tack on a little bit. Because I'm interested in is also as a historian, is there a way of repair? Is there a way of just dealing with facts have been created on the ground. What is actually possible? For instance, I cannot think right now quickly of an act of ethnic cleansing that has ever been reversed, right? This probably does not happen in history. So not a rosy outlook. So I'm curious how you think and how you view the individual sort of parties in this conflict pursuing the next steps. After all, we're talking about the next chapter here, right?
Right. So, yeah, of course, complex question without probably any good answers. If you don't mind, I'll give this actor by actor answer. It's actually quite a realist version of the answer, and then maybe also I'm a peace scholar, so like also say from the peace.
Yes, absolutely.
Studies perspective, what's even theoretically conceivable. In terms of that kind of actor by actor outlook, so again, this is not 1990s. There is no international norms necessarily being universally accepted in any practical sense. Certainly not in that part of the world. We are back to or forward towards more of a realist, in a way, conception of conflicts and foreign relations. In 1990s might have been different conversation, where in principle, at least there would have been bigger push towards some kind of a minority rights focused solutions. Not necessarily the case. So you don't see much of a focus on that conversation from almost no meaningful international actor. So with that, let me list them and we'll see a lot of them are aligned of this is a closed page, right? So Azerbaijan, obviously, we wouldn't ethnically cleanse if it had any intention of retaining Armenian population. So yes, its broader ambitions potentially are for even gaining more influence over the region. There is even worry about further inclusion into Armenian territory proper. So any return is conditioned so far of Armenians into Azerbaijan with a return of Azerbaijanis into Armenia, right? So essentially it's seen as reciprocal in that sense. Then if you want Karabakh Armenians back, then we're gonna send the 1990s refugees back into Armenia. Which is then becoming very difficult conversation for different reasons on its own. So it's actually clearly Azerbaijan doesn't show much of an interest or appetite for accepting people back, other than on individual capacity, sure. As in there is, in principle, at least they say the door is open, come accept Azerbaijani citizenship, come live as a regular Azerbaijani citizen, but then can you as an Armenian last name person, really take this?
Can I step in here for a moment? Because I mean, and this goes more to sort of the research I've been following about the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire. So one crucial aspect is property rights. Are property titles still recognized between the two, or what does that look like?
That's an extremely complicated question, and the second speaker actually has done research who isn't here. Would be good to check in with her. But from what I know, including being the editor of that article, so it's not necessarily my area of expertise, but it's a very complex question because what's property rights? Yeah. So first of all, a lot of the properties, let's say in Nagorno-Karabakh autonomy, specifically that territory that was mostly Armenian populated. So when the conflict started, it was still Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a communist state where, as in common property state, where we didn't all own homes. So you lived, it was all government property. You were assigned apartment to live in. So essentially that times it's a residence. You had a residence attached to you, but not property. So that's one version. Yeah. So that the same applies to Baku Armenians or to the Azerbaijanis who left, were deported out of Armenia in 1990s or 1980s. Effectively, there was no property as such. Later, it was privatized, and usually by the residents. So wherever you lived, you just got it as a property. So in principle, that's probably the most realistic version of calculating something that was held in 1980s by some families. And in some form, maybe talking about reparation, compensation, and exchange based on that. Legally speaking, I think that's as good as it can get. Further it gets, so these families who lived prior to 1880s somewhere, maybe there's some kind of a claim they could have. Although again, it was not a property, it was residence. Further, it gets far more complicated on numerous accounts. So the privatization of properties in Nagorno-Karabakh happened already under kind of Republic of Artsakh or Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh administration, which was never recognized by anybody, including Armenia, right? So let alone Azerbaijan, and now that is Azerbaijan. So obviously you cannot probably expect Azerbaijan recognize any kind of privatization done by Republic of Artsakh. Especially because also it has been done not on Armenian held properties, but also on a lot of Azerbaijani prior to that held properties, right? So essentially there is double reason of it's political, but second, a lot of privatization that Armenians took over homes, territories, and land was by Azerbaijanis who were ethnically cleansed, right? So essentially, the second reason it wouldn't be seen even kind of morally right, let's say, to even consider something like that from Azerbaijani perspective, right? So there's this layers of complication where it's practically impossible to anything that's past 1888 residents really consider, even internationally, make any kind of a serious claim. I would say will be extremely difficult from what I see. Again, there's also a question of property built. A lot of them are built past 1990 already, essentially. Territories kind of under de facto Republic of Artsakh administration, right? So all of this effectively have probably very, if not negative, maybe legal value. So it's pretty difficult to clarify. So property is very, very hard to even consider.
Sorry, but I sort of interrupted you in this sort of longer.
So going back forward to backwards to your question about the role. So okay, as Azerbaijan obviously has no interest internationally, more or less you can see the same, right? So practically no actor, including maybe softly European Union as a normative actor who kind of has to focus on minority rights, softly raises the question of return, but softly. So you don't see this coming from Russia, you don't see this coming from US, you don't see this coming from Armenia either. So essentially, you don't have practically any international actor who is in some form pushing for the return. In fact, I'll roll back past 2023. Between 2020 and 2023, you could hear a lot of private conversations by very, very high-ranking officials internationally saying that probably the solution is some form of population exchange, or it's 100,000 people maybe resettling. So that was almost preferred. So very harsh thing to say, but from here and there, you could notice essentially it was seen as, okay, you cannot live together anyways. So one way or another, you lost the war, as Armenia lost the war. So this is the eventual solution, however it's done through violence or through just agreement of moved population. So it seems like all the international actors are in agreement that it's a closed page. Different story, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh population itself, along with its political leadership, the ones that are not in prison in Azerbaijan, and certain segments of course, Armenians in diaspora and in Armenia who do. prefer some form of a return. Here, the interesting part is, again, unfortunately, I think this group of people is always 10 years behind in terms of what they demand. So now there is a request for autonomy, which is when the autonomy was on the table, that's pretty much the same group of people was only accepting independence, right? And then when independence was potentially discussed, then the border suddenly grew. So unfortunately, from what I'm seeing, they are kind of a bit too out of touch with reality in a sense of that, yes, they are accepting now a solution that prior to 2020 war was on the table and they reject it. And now essentially they want to go back to pre-2020, pre-Second Karabakh War. Solutions that were on the table, which are no longer on the table, right? So at this stage, now turning to, sorry, getting a bit long here, but maybe last point, what I see from peace studies perspective possible. So conflict resolution is very hard to imagine, again, pre-2020 type of a normative solution, since this has been effectively resolved through war. I say the best solution is, well, short-term conflict management, as in preventing further violence, which is still possible, but longer-term conflict transformation, right? In the sense of trying to make this two people, two societies see each other a bit less as enemies and a bit more as neighbors with whom you can coexist. Because without that, whoever holds the territory, the other cannot safely live there. So in current scenario, I don't see current configuration. I don't see any possibility of any Armenian safely living under Azerbaijani control and vice versa. So you need to really invest into complete change of human rights regimes at home, the rewriting of the textbooks, which portray the other one as essentially somebody with a legitimate target of violence because they have been genociders, supposedly, and so on. So all of that needs to change. We need a whole generation of some kind of transitional justice work, after which coexistence will become possible, after which we can talk about some kind of a mass rather than individual return with the hope of rights being upheld, right? So I think it's like almost 2-3-step process. But that requires a lot of intentional work, including transitional justice, rewriting of narratives, and creating human rights conditions, minority rights conditions where it's possible.
Yeah, wow, that is sobering to think of this as sort of a multi-generational process, actually, rather than something that can be sort of taken care of in a, say, a series of international conferences or so. But I find this argument very compelling. Let me look at the clock. I'd love to hear eventually more about sort of what kind of sort of civil society engagement you see there. But I'll hold that question and probably ask first. Open it up. We have a few questions in the Q&A, and we'll eventually come back to that. So let me. I don't know if can you see the questions coming in the Q&A? But I can also read them out for the audience at large. So here's the first question is, if the Artsakh Armenians apply for Armenian citizenship, would they be ineligible for international aid for refugees and or Armenian government aid as refugees?
I asked this question actually recently in Armenia. Don't have a clear answer. In principle, from what I understand, it's not like there is all that much aid distributed as refugees anyways. So there has been kind of initial round of settlement acceptance and quite a strong effort. But I don't know if there is any kind of a meaningful long-term assistance being provided. So housing resettlement, particularly if people accept to move out of big cities, which are overpopulated, and kind of move to underdeveloped, underpopulated areas. There is, I think, housing being provided and potentially some assistance, but it's more connected, I think, to settlement in underdeveloped areas or those that are losing population rather than necessarily refugee status. So as far as I know, there isn't all too much long-term refugee assistance in the first place. So there's not too much to lose, essentially, as far as I can think of. I think the political question, as in the right of return, is probably a bigger one. Those at least who hold the hope of a return. So there, as Armenian citizens, they might have I think that seemed to be more what holds people back from accepting this citizenship rather than any kind of meaningful assistance. But this is a somewhat of a informed answer from me. I don't have
Yeah. Let me quickly follow up in this, which strikes me as an sort of interesting pattern. I mean, we've always in the US have this discussion about, are immigrants actually good for the country? And there's this question of jobs, and so and here, so you have also an influx, although considered as at least close relatives. But are there jobs? Is there a labor market where they have an impact?
So there is this is a I think complicated question, I guess, whose perspective. So, but I'm just thinking from Armenian government's perspective, from what I can see here, there is this double-edged point. One is a potentially problematic politically population, because this is a population who is quite unhappy, right, with the way Armenian state was not able effectively to provide protection for them in Karabakh itself. So in principle, it can seen as potentially, if there are anti-government protests, this can be the group that actively engages if there is some kind of revanchist opposition raising voice. So that's one version of it, looking at it. The other version is that Armenia has a serious demographic problem because of very serious mass migration, in big part thanks to the war itself, right? So long-term, this 30 years of war and closed borders really led to a lot of brain drain and a lot of actually young people leaving the country. So suddenly you have an influx of a big number of quite young people, actually, on average. So it's seen as a potential positive, right? As in, if you can integrate this population. The challenges I don't think the jobs market is pretty strong. Overall, Armenian economy is very strong. Well, relatively, it's quite strong. So yeah, you do see very, very strong development overall in the last few years as Pashinyan came to power with all the international failures. Of course, one, but domestically, there is a reduction of corruption. There is a very strong, visible democratization. Small businesses are thriving. So you do have a very, very good climate. The salaries are up. So yes, I believe that that kind of integration is very much possible and necessary. Actually, they do need this workforce.
Okay. So let me move on to the next question in the Q&A here. So, who, if anyone, will guarantee Armenia's sovereignty if Azerbaijan's ambition turns its eye on Armenia proper?
Well, tough question. Of course, I don't think we have answers in a sense of that hasn't been essentially until Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Really, you didn't have that would have been, in principle, you would expect everybody in some form stand up to this. I think that's now weakened some of the norms. Having said that, you haven't seen really, there has been a small inclusion of important, violent, but a small inclusion of Azerbaijan into Armenia proper about 2 years ago, but 3 years now. But in general, as Azerbaijani army came in militarily, they could completely cut through Armenia and go to Nakhchivan in 2020, and then a number of times after, they haven't really crossed in any serious way into the Armenia. So they are in the way the understanding is still there that one thing is Karabakh, which was always internationally accepted as Azerbaijan. It's a whole other story to cross into Armenia proper. Then Azerbaijan becomes the occupier. It's not the position it has ever been, actually, right? So it's been always defending, internationally speaking, its own rights for its territory. But it hasn't crossed there. So that's probably the biggest guarantee, I would say, is Azerbaijan not wanting to cross into the space where it potentially becomes an, internationally legitimate actor or seen as an occupier on its own. So that, for me, in my view, this is the strongest. Other than, you can probably talk about Iran. I guess the biggest actor that has the most serious interest and claim of not getting there. You would actually see Turkey not being particularly, not that they don't say it, but publicly, but don't necessarily have interest in seeing any kind of border revisions in the mass, because they might not come up on the winning end necessarily, or they don't want to get into competition with Iran or Russia. So I'd say, if anything, is the regional actors. I think Azerbaijan and Russia are probably trickiest in that sense, and might not mind revision of borders. But also, of course, you will see a strong reaction from the West, but it will be rhetorical. Yes, France coming across as a big supporter of Armenia, but it will stay in Paris and make sense, right? So, but it might also put some pressures and sanctions on Azerbaijan. So overall, you can expect a reaction if kind of the international borders are breached. It will be very different from essentially people accepting the Karabakh Azerbaijan as international.
Does that relative confidence that you're expressing here extend to the question of, say, the Zangezur corridor, where, for instance, I've seen a lot of noise, at least, and I mean, and this needs to be taken with a few pounds of salt, of course, in the Turkish press, for instance, about this being the next thing. But I've also heard a lot of concern from the Armenian side and from here in the Armenian communities that that is an imminent threat.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. As in, I don't know if we have an answer, in the sense of, I think the answer changes weekly, maybe monthly. A lot depends here on my belief, and I'm not as in my analysis, let's say, rather than belief, is that is actually Russia's demand and interest primarily because in 2020 agreement, a ceasefire agreement, effectively this territory was whatever now is known as Zangezur corridor, was to be controlled by Russia effectively to then let Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan interest is to freely pass through, right? But Russia's interest is to have its military standing there. In particular, interest grew further when eventually it was asked to leave Karabakh. So if Russia wanted military presence in the region through which it exercises some control, initially it was supposed to be through its peacekeepers in Karabakh, but then these peacekeepers were invited out by Azerbaijan recently. So essentially now it's seen as another version of coming into the region militarily, effectively. So I think it's a more complex question for the other actors because, does Azerbaijan want to potentially engage in military adventure, take over Armenian territory and hand it over to Russia? So it's more complex than that. So as in, and yet maybe it's possible. So I don't know if that's the answer is yes right now, either from Azerbaijan or Turkey, but it could change if Russia is to reassert itself, and then they might prefer to play on the Russian side, right? So then advantages. So I think it's a very, very moving, quickly moving, and very depending on the power balance in the region and Russia's intentions and ability, let's say, to impose itself on the Caucasus. It might change, but I would look into Moscow's interest there first, and then Baku, and then only Ankara. So
right. So as
but also also Tehran, who is extremely opposed to any kind of into Armenian territory. So it's tricky.
Yeah. So one of the questions I see in the chat is actually asking probably that a direct follow-up is how the war in Ukraine actually changes or adds layers of complexity to the story here. And I think you have sort of in part addressed it, but if you want to quickly add to that.
2020, prior to 2020, this has been seen as a very much a balance between West and Russia. Okay, maybe Russia had a bit stronger hand, but overall, right? So Georgia was pretty pro-Western at the time, seen as a state. Armenia was balancing. Azerbaijan was balancing its own ways, right? And then when in 2020 war, effectively Russia stayed out and South essentially supported Azerbaijan. And then came in with these peacekeepers. Turkey participated openly in the war. It has been seen as a Russian-Turkish joint geopolitical victory, as I mentioned earlier. So Russian invasion of Ukraine completely changed the power balance, not in favor of Russia, because like it, first of all, militarily had to pull its forces into Ukraine. The war didn't go, of course, to its liking, but also its dependence on Azerbaijan and Turkey grew exponentially. And then whatever has seen long-term strategic goal of Russia to get its army into Azerbaijan, into Karabakh, but for its purposes into Azerbaijan, it had to withdraw a year almost in, right? So this big strategic achievement supposedly was withdrawn. So Russia has been in a quickly losing end in terms of its power, but it also can come back. It's still, for the region's purposes and size, despite its relative weakness, it can, if it really makes this a target, probably can reassert itself. But the West really used this opportunity very clearly and tried to come back after that for two reasons. First of all, the opportunity was there after Russia essentially weakened after the invasion, and the tension was shifted. But also because it has an interest in some form of a second front, let's say. Yes, so maybe not directly because nobody in the region intends to necessarily participate in war against Russia. But politically, it makes a stronger kind of reverences and much stronger asserts itself. So I haven't seen this kind of U.S.-Armenia relationship at this level. I say maybe since Bill Clinton, right? So like 30 years, you never saw this kind of an active involvement where on a personal level. Now Pelosi was here, right? So you have a very often USAID head visiting. So it's a very on the Blinken, Sullivan, very high U.S. level, and European Union, Macron level, and so on. You see almost weekly reverences in some form towards Armenia. But it also backfires. Georgia then goes in the opposite direction, right? So kind of being worried more about being drawn into this conflict. It's actually turning very quickly authoritarian, kind of a more close relations with Russia. So it became a very seriously tricky region. But all of this essentially is a result of Russia's attack on Ukraine. Again, Georgia, for example, got scared and now being more pro-Russian. Armenia got scared and being more anti-Russian, right? So the reactions are very mixed.
Okay. Thank you. So we have our next question sort of goes in an entirely different direction, but so in your experience as conflict resolution scholar, how can efforts to protect and preserve cultural heritage be integrated into broader peace-building processes? The UNESCO framework calls for the protection of cultural heritage in conflict zones. So do you see the future of cultural heritage sites in former Artsakh, such as the Papit and Tatik statue, to be an avenue towards future cooperation over heritage preservation and to serve as a stepping stone towards reconciliation?
I mean, it might. So in terms of cultural heritage, it can go in two directions, right? It can go towards complete obliteration. We've seen that over and over, right? So now in Turkey, after the genocide, you've seen complete wipeout of Armenian heritage. You've seen also similar moves pretty much all over. Yeah, so the place. So that very much can be the direction that things go, and that needs to be ideally prevented, of course, and how to prevent it and how to turn this into potential positive. So again, the reliance on international norms isn't necessarily again same as in 90s. No, but that's like I don't know how much UNESCO as such could do. It should try. So norms aren't necessarily taken all that seriously, let's say, in Azerbaijan, but overall anywhere in the region anymore. But Azerbaijan is interestingly, as a realist actor, it also is very sensitive to its international image. So it's a very interesting mix. So, for example, it wouldn't, in terms of its repressions domestically, politically, it's not paying too much attention to what's being said. It prioritizes regime security and jailing and harassing every even smallest criticism. But in other areas, it's quite sensitive to being seen as a legitimate actor. Yeah, so it's hosting right now the UN Climate Summit in 2 months, and so on. So it's Formula One. So it is overall trying to position itself as a legitimate, serious, long-term, mid-sized power. So in that sense, it is quite again sensitive. And if it's approached right, in my view, the best chance you have, as difficult as to accept, but it is to actually in some form incentivize the Azerbaijani government to position itself as the actor that preserves cultural heritage, right? Groups, again, if this is the goal, right? A continuous confrontation probably in that sense will lead to the opposite, as in, the kind of wiping out of both homes and cultural heritage of Armenians to make it less hospitable for any kind of a future return. Again, I don't know if that strategy can get you anywhere, but probably the best chance we have without any kind of international leverage is to Azerbaijani government itself to make the calculation that it needs the preservation. I don't see any international pressure getting there.
Let me put the next two questions together. One is from Gamaghelyan, was a fellow at CIS here. And she's asking, given the current dynamics, it seems that Armenians have a stronger interest in pursuing peace, while Azerbaijan may have less incentive to start a peacekeeping agenda. How do you see long-term peaceful cohabitation being achieved in such a geopolitically non-homogeneous situation where the balance of power is unequal? And let me just tack on the second question from Ismi Agayev. The events taking place inside Azerbaijan with Bahruz Hamadov and others related cases show that the peace talks pose a vital threat to the peace activists of young people and journalists. So please, can you explain whether and how such cases mean delaying the peace process?
Oh, yeah, it's the same question, but so pretty again complex one. So sorry, as an academic, I'm gonna still take a step back and give a bit of a conceptual frame here before answering the question. Again, I think a lot of times by inertia, we are thinking in very much 1990s, 2000s framework of international norms and peace actors and yeah, and civil society's role. So all of that is out the window. None of that exists anymore in any meaningful sense. Actors exist, some inertia exists, some funding stream exists, and that puts people in danger because essentially they are playing again 2000s game when NGOs and these kind of initiatives were by and large accepted, despite some authoritarian moves, right? While now kind of the governments are trying to take full control, especially authoritarian governments, of anything that remotely political, and any kind of gatherings of people and discussion of political future is seen as at least challenging that monopoly, right? So I think we need to accept that we are working now in an extremely authoritarian space where again these international norms and civil society is not only seen as secondary, which was the case, or unimportant, which was the case in the past, but potentially as dangerous by its own existence, right? So it's now we are talking about some kind of activism in very authoritarian space with complete disregard to international norms. So I think that we need to take as a baseline, unfortunately, moving forward. That's one. The value is not seen at all. It's actually seen as a danger, right? What can be done, right? So one thing is that also what these groups do should be completely rethought. Yeah, because in the past the thinking was this: there was some kind of a formula for solution on a table. So now whether it will be independence or autonomy or whatever was yeah, so it was, could have been debated and should have been solved on political level. But in principle, there was to be some kind of a resolution, and that some kind of a resolution was to be built on the essentially liberal democratic norms. There should have been norms, yeah, so the minority rights would have been preserved, right? So substantially some kind of return, rights would be given, and there will be solution based on normative principles of self-determination, territorial integrity. And meanwhile, civil society was trying to kind of bring groups together so people eventually can coexist, right? Or can overcome their enmity. So essentially you were doing this work on a background as civil society, supporting the eventual political solution. Political solution was pretty much pre-agreed that's going to be within kind of international norms sphere. So that second one is out the window, right? So it was won, Azerbaijan won militarily. It actually went autocratization route. It's not essentially integrating Armenians. So none of these precursors to what civil society was contributing to exist. International norms don't exist. Nobody abides by this. So there is no solution, essentially. There is no solution, agreed solution, negotiated solution in the future. That's simply that doesn't exist. That's removed. Without that, the role of civil society then should change as well. So I see two places where there is a need for work, not to support any kind of peace agreement. That's irrelevant. The one is prevention. And I don't know, again, if civil society has a role here, but prevention of further violence. And that's mostly international actors. Yeah, so conflict management, managing violence, not allowing this to cross into new borders. But where civil society can contribute, I think, is conflict transformation. So no short-term gains here, but change of discourse, right? These kind of conversations where we can talk kind of in Armenian space about Azerbaijani narratives and Azerbaijani grievances, why there was such a strong mobilization in Azerbaijan. Yeah, it's because there has been their own story of victimhood in this, and vice versa. Let's talk in Azerbaijan about what they've done to Armenians, right? Again, all kind of war crimes that have been committed throughout these wars, right? So talk about this and take responsibility for them. Talk about changing of narratives through textbooks, through, I don't know, movies, through books written about this conflict, like trying to make them a bit less one-sided. So the only role I see is this longer term effort towards transforming relationship. And I do see it possible because, in a way, the basis for the conflict is violently but removed, right? So essentially, we don't have necessarily anything to fight with each other about right now, unless we create some new war. Yes, Azerbaijan invades Armenia, we have a new basis for a war. But currently, given that no political actor demands kind of reinstatement of Artsakh, there doesn't seem to be any political reason essentially for enmity. Yeah. So that's why I see possibility of kind of slower work towards transformation. But trying to interfere in politics will be, confronted very strongly, particularly by the Azerbaijani government. And this straight up dangerous without necessarily any benefit, in my view.
This sounds sort of very depressing for at the same time, one wants to think that might probably also eventually make activists like Bahruz Samadov appear less dangerous. But so we hope that eventually he will be released.
If I can comment on that, I do not believe that Bahruz Samadov is actually arrested for his collaboration with Armenians as such. I believe that his danger is in systematically criticizing the Azerbaijani government on social media very publicly for a lot of things, including the conflict, but also his domestic politics. So I think Bahruz Samadov and others' danger is seen more in this critique of the government.
I see.
And this is a convenient excuse to arrest for collaboration with Armenians.
I see.
I don't believe that necessarily collaboration with like 2 articles with Armenians here and there pose any kind of danger to
I see.
government.
Okay. Yeah. So we have actually 2 questions that sort of take us back to more to the government level. One is how do you think the conflict in Karabakh can be transformed from frozen conflict to a more dynamic and peaceful process? And what are the key steps that need to be taken to achieve this? Can Armenia, by any chance, do that with the current government? And the second question that I wanted to connect to this is whether you could speak about the Armenian government's diplomacy with Turkey, Azerbaijan, Russia, and so forth, and the risks involved.
Let me start with the second. I think the Armenian government, well, Armenian state, I would say, including this particular government, has lost a lot of, almost nearly all leverage it had, right? So it's successive Armenian governments, including the current one, when they held some kind of political cards, right? So when they essentially held Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijani territories and had the possibility to negotiate a solution, didn't. They again pushed for the demands that were completely not only politically and from realist perspective unreasonable, which clearly they were because they asked for too much and couldn't hold, right? So not realizing that they are in a much weaker military position, but they also didn't see that they're in a very weak diplomatic position, right? So essentially that by holding to specifically Azerbaijani territories outside of Karabakh, they lost even this normative argument internationally, and didn't want to notice that either, that their own propaganda only works internally. Nobody outside buys it. Again, they cannot hold it militarily, they cannot hold it diplomatically. And essentially having lost this through war, lost any kind of bargaining space. In addition, what they didn't notice, unfortunately, that the relative weight of Armenia and Azerbaijan completely shifted, right? Armenia has very, very little value as a country to practically anybody, while Azerbaijan increasingly has value, right? So obvious one is that oil and gas reserves that it sells. Yeah, so what to Europe and towards East, it became even more important after sanctions on Russia because it's even more valuable now a state, but also it played its political game, right? Actually building alliances, right? So it has a very strong alliance with Turkey, but also has a even better relationship, much better relationship with Russia suddenly than Armenia had, supposedly being long-term ally, and is very valuable for the West. So Armenia has very, very, very little leverage, and I'm sorry for multiple variants here, but intentionally because it practically has nothing to offer to any external actor other than essentially being not willing to, yes, it's trying to remain democratic, and as such, not that democracy itself, I think, is valued by anybody anymore, internationally speaking, but that it's a different actor as such than from all the others. So, like similar to Georgia in the past, in a way, if Azerbaijan and Russia and Turkey can forge some kind of authoritarian alliance, so in this sense, Armenia becomes some kind of leverage point, yeah, that can be potentially used essentially as a area of influence either for Eastern actors, let's say, as in I mentioned India a number of times trying to come in, or West. So I think I don't see much of a political leverage. It's just other than trying to survive and trying to leverage its and play its position. I don't think it can negotiate all that much, frankly. What it has, though, and I said it before, I don't think it's secondary. I think it's very relevant. That internally it actually managed to have quite a serious reform. So if you see Armenia now compared to Armenia 10 years ago, it's a much, much more livable place. It's not an accident you see massive Russian migration into Armenia. You never had Armenia being a place of immigration. It was always people migrating out. Now you have Indians and Russians and Persians moving into Armenia. Not an accident, right? So it's actually the most probably livable place. I don't think it's an accident. I don't think it's a lethal value. Yes, it came at a very heavy price, but it is something very different from Azerbaijan, let's say, that yes, has a lot of international leverage, and you post something on Twitter and you go to prison, like, with all the disadvantages of international Armenia, where do you want to live? I believe without a question, the answer is Armenia. So that's something, a very big value that I hope we can all help preserve.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm looking at the clock. I think we have time for one more question. So let me pose this one here. And I apologize to all those who have submitted questions that I have not, that we haven't been able, although it seems to me that most of those that will end up unanswered have been touched upon. But this one is more specific and asks, how has the Azerbaijani government handled the repopulation of the region, and what's their plan moving forward?
There was actually one question about current Armenian government I didn't answer. Maybe I'll get later. I'll get to it later. So let me answer the direct question. Azerbaijani government has a very authoritarian, very one center led down government. It has very little infrastructure for anything like the proper repopulation of such a big territory. Actually, interestingly, Azerbaijani government at some point, you were hearing this during negotiations prior to 2020, there was some suggestions that they actually wouldn't mind just if we are to slower process of peace agreement where one territory as opposed to 5, which we thought they were supposed to be returned by Armenia, just one territory is returned, and then 5 years, and then maybe demilitarization. Then second, because they were saying, oh, we're going to have a problem reintegrating, and I don't think it was heard or understood by Armenian side that they meant that it could be 20, 30 years of very slow kind of peace agreement. Unfortunately, again, we lost that point. But I think it's really struggling with reintegration. Well, there's objective reasons, mines, complete destruction of cities such as Ardam, and so it needs to be reconstructed, but also 30 years of people not living there, but also no civil society. So now I think it comes to bite you in that situation because like so centrally moving hundreds of thousands of people, yes, you can build the houses, right? But how do you create this infrastructure? It's been pretty slow. Yes, Shusha, depending on the language we use, has been specifically made, center because symbolically, and there's a lot of development you can see there. But outside of that, it's very, very minimal. Strategic areas are being intentionally populated, right? So borders, this like Lachin type of places that potentially can become important as a human shield, essentially, if there is any kind of a military escalation, but it's very strategic, primarily human shield type, I'd say, population. it's going to take probably decades to even see any kind of serious development there. And if I quickly turn to the question of current Armenian government versus non-Armenian government, I have very little sympathy to the current government for two accounts. One is that they effectively brought us to the war. They had the chance to negotiate in 2018, 2019. They effectively refused. And I see that I think, yes, all the previous ones are just as responsible for not solving the conflict, but this current one is the one that couldn't see the writing on the wall and specifically ended up in a losing war. Having said that, I don't see right now any difference, frankly, of this or any other government can do differently. If the question is, and I'm assuming there is this sub-question, other question, if there is some kind of revanchism or different, essentially new war can be done by a different government, I think it's complete suicide by any kind of Armenian state moving forward at least 50 years, right? So as in, I think that this balance of power is palpable, like even vis-a-vis Azerbaijan alone, let alone Azerbaijan and Turkey together, it's complete suicide. So even consideration, and even to 50 years down the road, it means starting to arm now. That means if you start arming now, Azerbaijan can arm much quicker, right? So even moving in that direction is dangerous. So I think so I don't see any difference. Is this the government or another government externally? There is simply complete power, extreme power weakness, yeah, very objectively. But internally, this government, for good or bad, has done well with building certain democratic and non-corrupt systems. So whichever next government comes, and I do hope there is a new government, I hope it doesn't take us back to authoritarianism and complete corruption that we had for the previous 30 years.
Well, thank you so much. I think we should let you off the hook. So I would ask the audience to give a round of applause via Zoom. Thank you so much. This has been extremely illuminating, although not always sort of rosy and positive, but realism is helpful. Thank you. And we will look forward to probably see you engage again in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.